Good morning, everybody. Michael the Maven. Today, to commemorate the most epic photo shoot of all time, we are going to be talking about 50 amazing facts of the Apollo 11 photo shoot. Buckle up, this is going to be an amazing ride. Let's dive into Apollo 11. In the beginning, photography was really a recreational thing that the astronauts did. There's a story of John Glenn going to a thrift store and buying a random camera off the shelf and then modifying it. And it wasn't until later space flights that photography became an integral part of the scientific research that astronauts did on these missions. Nearly 100,000 photographs were taken by the early lunar probes, many of which crashed directly into the surface of the moon. Remember that in 1969, there was no such thing as digital cameras. So the question then becomes how did the images or these pictures get back to Earth if there was no such thing as a digital picture? It turns out that NASA actually built film development technology into the probes. So the film was developed, scanned, and basically radioed back. That is pretty mind-blowing for the 1960s. There were actually several cameras on the Apollo 11. This was very carefully planned. The star photography cameras were the Hasselblad 500 ELs. Two of them were very similar. They were painted black to remove reflections from the command module as well as the lunar module. And these were designed to stay in the cockpits. There was a very special, very highly modified Hasselblad 500 referred to as the Hasselblad data camera. Up until Apollo 8, these Hasselblad cameras had to be advanced using a crank. So it was a manual film advance. And Hasselblad developed an electric film advance. Even though it increased the weight, it reduced the number of steps and it made it more likely that there wouldn't be problems. These Hasselblad cameras were 70 millimeters, medium format. The media that could be exposed was 56 millimeters by 56 millimeters. We'll be talking about crop factors in just a second. So out of those three Hasselblad cameras, one stayed with Michael Collins in the command module that was orbiting. One stayed inside the Eagle, and those two were fitted with a 2.8 80 millimeter wide angle planar Zeiss lens. Now you're probably wondering 80 millimeters is not wide angle. Remember that because these are medium format cameras, these lenses behave quite differently when we consider the crop factor, which is the equivalent focal length of a 35 millimeter frame of film. It's about 0.54, but when we take into consideration the aspect ratio equivalent of a 35, these 80 millimeter lenses really behaved in the ballpark of a 33 millimeter focal length. There was also a 250 millimeter 5.6, but I haven't seen many pictures taken with that, and I think it stayed mostly unused. As for the camera that made it onto the surface of the moon during the moonwalk, that was a 70 millimeter 2.8 lens. And again, if we take into all the consideration of the crop factor and the aspect ratio, we're looking at the equivalent focal length of about 26 millimeters. Zeiss engineered some very specific lenses to be used on these missions that were optically superior in terms of sharpness, micro contrast. This was the real deal. They were designed for the moon landing. Now, when you take a camera out into outer space, there are a number of problems. For example, it could be negative 65 degrees Celsius, far beyond freezing, and it can also get really, really hot, 140 degrees Celsius. And because of these temperature changes varying so much, this is the reason the camera was painted silver, was to help maintain its temperature. And there was another problem with traditional lubricants, that under these conditions, it would evaporate and leave residue on the film plate. So the lubricants had to be re-engineered, the seals had to be re-engineered, and every consideration had to be made in order for this camera to operate in the vacuum of space. One of the problems the astronauts faced was the number of shots they can hold in a cartridge. The Hasselblad cameras up to that point traditionally held between 12 or 24 shots. So what happened was Kodak stepped in and engineered a new type of film that was very strong and very thin. It would allow the film cartridges to hold 200 black and white or 160 color images, and that film can still be purchased today under the name Ektachrome. The film backs and the cassettes were highly modified to make them easy to use and also interchange. There were buckles and different components on it. Something that I thought was fascinating, that if you look at some of the famous magazines that came back, we're talking about Magazine S in particular, there are instructions there talking about the aperture, the shutter speed, and what to change the camera according to whether or not somebody was in the shadow or in the direct sunlight of the moon. You can see these stickers on black and white cassettes as well. Well, we will never know the exact exposure settings because there was no metadata recorded onto the film. We do have an idea that the shutter speed should have been 1/250th of a second, that if he was shooting in the shadows, it should have been f5.6 aperture, and if he was shooting in direct sunlight, it should have been f11. In this way, it simplified the entire process for the astronauts just to dial in the distance for focus and making those adjustments to the aperture when needed, and then positioning the body. They had to be mindful of whether they were in shade or in direct sunlight. Now, because the astronauts are in spacesuits that are obviously big and bulky and hold a lot of oxygen, they needed their hands free to do different kinds of work, experiments, moving around, things of that nature. They needed a way to secure the camera, and what the engineers developed was a lens mount into their chest rig. They also modified the camera with a grip and a trigger to make it easier to take the pictures with those bulky gloves on. Also keep in mind that with this bulky space helmet, they're not going to be able to look down in that viewfinder, so the viewfinder was removed, no viewfinder. In some cases, there was a little wire frame. In other lenses on later missions, you could see an arrow pointing on the lens to help them line up, but they actually went through special photography training to learn how to point their bodies because the camera was rigged directly to their harness. Because of the automatic film advance, all they had to worry about was setting the shutter speed, the aperture, and the distance. Remember, these were not auto-focusing cameras, so the astronauts had to measure their focusing point based on distance. So when you're taking all these things into consideration, we have to give them a lot of credit as photographers. I'm thinking in particular of Neil Armstrong, his composition, his ability to nail things in focus. In some of the pictures I can see he changed the exposure according to the situation. He did a fantastic job. Something that you're going to notice about all the images taken on the surface of the moon are these little black crosses, and these were engraved onto something called the Rousseau plate. These little crosses allowed engineers to calculate the distance and the size of the subject matter, much in the same way that Apple uses face recognition technology. And to think that NASA was doing this in 1969, come on, Apple, you're a bunch of slackers. One of the problems engineers had with the cameras is that on Earth, obviously with air, the static that would build up between the camera and the film plate would dissipate on the metal rollers. The problem with this is that in outer space, there is no air. So to resolve this, the engineers built two special thin strips on the side of the film mount that would dissipate the electricity to other parts of the camera that were metal. Had they not done this, enough static electricity could be built up and actually create a spark. And as a safety precaution, due to what happened in Apollo 1, there could be no synthetic materials used in the cameras. Now, if you haven't seen it, in 2019, there was an amazing documentary put together called Apollo 11. It is amazing. That documentary was put together when somebody had found some lost footage of some large format motion picture cameras. Now, when I say large format for film cameras, that's very different than large format for stills. Those are two different things, and I actually have a video that talks about the differences between stills and motion picture if you want to kind of understand why 60 or 75 millimeter motion picture film is not the same as 70 millimeter still film. Check that video out. When we take into consideration that they were on the surface of the moon for 21 hours, we have to remember only 2 hours and 20 minutes of that time was spent walking outside of the Eagle. There was some time spent actually sleeping, things of that nature. But when you look at the total number of images taken, and it's kind of hard to get a concrete number, how many were taken in the moonwalk. On the low end, it was at least 480, something like that. If we do the math and we take the number of shots per minute of the moonwalk, minimum 3.4 images per minute. And when we take into consideration the phone call to President Nixon, the scientific experiment, walking around, doing their tests, suffice it to say that the photography was a major aspect, a major part of the tests done in the first moonwalk of the moon. Makes me very proud as a photographer. Keep in mind that as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were on the surface of the moon, Michael Collins was in the command module, orbiting, just sitting there waiting for him to come back. And remember, he had a camera with him, and he also took some pretty amazing images. There's an interview that he discussed that as close as they were to the moon, the Earth was far more fascinating.
The moon was nothing compared to the Earth. The Earth was it. It was the centerpiece. It was all there was. We had an emotional I suppose, a rope attaching us to planet Earth. For whatever reason, it was what we wanted to look at.
Many other astronauts have talked about this. They call it Earth gazing. It has been described by some as almost hypnotic. You can't help but to stop and look at the Earth. It was these early images that came from the Apollo missions as well as earlier flights that gave rise to some of the most famous Earth images that you surely have seen by now. These images are given credit for bringing awareness to the Earth, and many others believe these images are directly responsible for giving interest to the subjects of ecology and Earth conservationism. Something that was pretty fascinating to me was the fact that NASA likes to have backups. There were two things they did not have backups for on the moon landing. Number one, there was no backup for the rocket in the ascent stage, which is kind of scary. And the second thing they didn't have a backup for was another moon camera. That Hasselblad data camera was the only one they brought with them that could be taken outside of the Eagle. And President Nixon even had a speech prepared if they were to be stranded on the moon. So many of the images have been attacked by conspiracy theorists saying the evidence lies within and proves that it never happened. The truth of the matter is Photoshop wasn't even invented until 1987, and many of the claims are in regards to the flag. How could it be flowing in the wind? Well, there was actually a crossbar holding it up. Many conspiracy theorists argue that because there's no stars visible, clearly this didn't happen on the moon, but even beginning photographers know that when you expose for bright sunlight, the background such as stars would get washed out. So you just can't expose for astrophotography and sun in the same shot. It's impossible. Another amazing fact is that as they were landing, one of the data cameras was recording the surface, the topography of the moon. And it was this topography that they were able to use to match up and find the exact location where the Eagle landed. And there is even a PDF that somebody went through the trouble of matching up every single image as it matched with the surface of the moon in its topographical aspects. So what I'm saying is the data collected in terms of the visuals, the video, the stills are very amazing evidence that if you can go outside and look through a telescope and see a lot of these structures on the moon now, to fake something like this is just not within the realm of sanity. Many hundreds of thousands who watched on television, watched them put the astronauts in the rocket and fly up into outer space. The whole thing was tracked. There's journals from start to finish, but there's just no way this was faked in 1969. CGI didn't exist. It would have been harder to fake it than it would be to actually do it. Now, there's a lot of misunderstanding that there were no pictures of Neil Armstrong taken on the surface of the moon. That's not true. There were precisely 5 images taken, one of which was in the Eagle as they had finished the moonwalk. There are 4 others, but probably the most famous one is his reflection in the helmet of Buzz Aldrin. The truth of the matter is there was a handoff of the Hasselblad camera. You can read about it in the NASA journals where Neil Armstrong gave the camera to Buzz. Buzz went and did his photography shots and the camera was then later handed back. And to prove this point, many of the footprint images were taken by Buzz Aldrin, not Neil Armstrong. Now, something about the camera and its size was the hatch they had to crawl out with all their gear. With the camera, they wouldn't fit. So in order to set up Neil Armstrong initially, the camera had to be lowered to him by Buzz Aldrin with a string. And as they returned back into the Eagle, the camera had to be picked up again. Talking about the 2 16mm Mauer motion picture cameras, if you watch the 2019 documentary on Apollo 11, we can see one of these cameras being set up in the window by Neil Armstrong as he's preparing to exit. He even talks about it taking shots at 1 frame per second. A cool side note about one of the 16mm motion picture cameras is that Neil Armstrong secretly kept one, and it wasn't discovered until after his death in 2012 that they found it in his home. Let's talk about the television camera that was broadcasting the signal live from the surface of the moon with over 600 million people watching. It was built by a company called Westinghouse. It measured 11 by 6 by 3 inches and weighed 7.25 pounds. It used 6.25 watts of power, and it was capable of operating at 10 or 0.65 frames per second, depending on how much light there was, and it had 4 interchangeable lenses. Now, some conspiracy theorists also ask if Neil Armstrong was the first man on the moon, who was recording him when it happened. The truth of the matter is the camera was built into the descent stage of the Eagle, and this panel opened up. It was designed to do this, to record the footage of the ladder as he exited. So sorry, it was just automated. Something that was noticeable, that as this signal was relayed all over the Earth, the image degraded a little bit, and that's why some of it is regarded as not the best footage. A lot of this has to do with the relay between towers. After Neil Armstrong's historic steps onto the surface of the moon, the Westinghouse television camera was taken off of the descent stage and it was put on a tripod. It looks more like a light stand, and it was set up to record the astronauts' activities as they worked about. Now, this video camera was connected by a cable, and the astronauts described that lunar dust as like wet sand. Also, remember, it's 1/6 the gravity of Earth, and so the video cable would not lay flat, and it was also really hard to see. So they were constantly tripping over it. It became a real hazard as they were going about their work. That signal was interestingly also broadcast to Disneyland, where visitors at Tomorrowland could watch the moon landing in real time. Okay, maybe not real time, it probably was a few second delay. There was also a stereoscopic Kodak camera. It's pretty well documented that the Eagle almost landed in a giant crater without some quick thinking by Neil Armstrong, who quickly averted it, took over the manual controls, and landed with very little fuel left. The interesting thing is, Neil Armstrong appears to have walked to that crater, and there is an amazing panorama that includes the Eagle and at least one of the giant craters on the moon. Due to the critical weight restrictions needed to return to Earth, and remember they had collected a lot of moon rocks, they were instructed to leave the Hasselblad cameras on the surface of the moon. There are actually at least 12 Hasselblads that are still up there today. Television camera 2 was also left behind. As far as I can tell, only 4 Hasselblad space cameras from the Apollo missions returned to Earth, and one of them was attempted to be sold. There are some discrepancies and an interesting history in it. It's confirmed that it at least flew on a mission. It looks right, it's painted right, but there's obviously these little discrepancies. That camera sold for almost $1 million in 2014. Again, it's really hard to say how many pictures were taken outside the Eagle, in the Eagle, but we do know that 9 exposed rolls were brought back, and originally 33 unexposed rolls made the flight. It's pretty safe to assume that at least some unexposed rolls of film were probably discarded with the cameras. Now, as many of you are probably planning your space mission to the moon to recover the lunar cameras to sell on eBay, many of you are probably wondering, where exactly are they? And the question then becomes, can you see the landing site of Apollo 11 from the Earth? Depends on what you're looking for, but if we're looking for something like the flag that was about 4 feet wide, you would need a telescope about 200 meters wide. The largest telescope available on the Earth is only 10 meters wide, so suffice it to say, a telescope is not going to do it. Even if you were looking for something like a rover on some of those later missions, you would need a telescope at least 75 meters wide to see it. Although it may be possible at some time in the future, when we have the power of a telescope, you should be able to, at some point, be able to see exactly where we landed on the moon. The good news is that the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which was sent up in 2009 and has been mapping the surface of the moon, is obviously a lot closer. We're 240,000 miles away. It flies as close as 30 miles away, and it has actually taken pictures of the original Apollo 11 landing site. We can still see not only the descent stage, we can see the footprints of the astronauts from this reconnaissance orbiter. I think that's pretty amazing. So not only do we know the area of where the Apollo 11 landed, we also have some very interesting statements from Hasselblad that the cameras were taken into the Eagle and discarded after, which means we know the exact location of at least $2 million worth of camera equipment, probably more, and it's just waiting there for anybody to go grab it. I wish you luck. And as a side note, the flag is up there as well, and they saw it fall over. So when you're up there collecting those cameras, be sure to stand the flag up again. So there's a really cool story that when Neil Armstrong was returning to the Eagle, climbing into the ascent stage, he dropped one of the film canisters from the chute, Magazine S. It's famous, it's in the Smithsonian if you want to see it. Well, the problem with this was it got covered in moon dust. And so as they packed the film canisters away, they wrapped it up in plastic, and Buzz Aldrin wrote a note giving specific instructions. handled this with care. We dropped it, there's some moon dust on it. It was packed away, and then after the landing, a photography technician, Terry Sleezak, worked for NASA, didn't see the note. So he opened the package, and all of a sudden there's this black moon dust all over his hands. Terry Sleezak, the unknowing photographer working for NASA, became the first human on Earth to ever touch moon dust. He had to go through a decontamination process. Boy, that Magazine S had a rough time, because as they were getting ready to prepare development, there was an accident in the machine that would have ruined the entire canister. There's some ethylene oxide that was released. Luckily, they were doing some tests immediately before, and they caught the error. Otherwise, we wouldn't have these spectacular images we do today. In 1984, NASA and Hasselblad came out with an astronaut's photography manual. It's a 37-page booklet. I'll put that link in the description if you want to see tips of how to take images in space. In June of 1976, NASA intern Gary George purchased 1,150 reels of magnetic tape for $217.77. It turns out that this was the moon landing footage, and it was recently auctioned off for $1.8 million. My final and last big fascinating fact about the Apollo 11 landing is that all of the images taken by NASA, a government agency, cannot be copyrighted and therefore are in the public domain. You are free to use them as long as you follow some minor guidelines with the NASA logo and showing people things of that nature. Yeah, it's free domain. Pretty amazing. If you enjoyed the commentary in the history of famous images, hit that subscribe button and notification bell, because we have a bunch more coming. And if you're a photographer struggling to learn your own camera, you'll be thrilled to know that I have a huge collection of crash course training videos. I'll teach you from A to Z, from start to finish, and you can learn your camera in just a few hours. In any event, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you next time.